Hello and welcome to Simply Radical. This is an old school banger, Lenin, State and Revolution. The audio for this entire script clocks in at nearly an hour and a half. So I am going to split this video in 5 parts. Part 1 includes the preface and Chapter 1, Class, Society, and the State. I would say enjoy, but I prefer that you don't. Learning must never be fun.
If you've ever heard of the concept of communism, chances are you know 2 things about it. Number 1, it's bad, evil, terrible, murdered 612 gorillion, Stalin is gonna come suck your toes in your sleep tonight. And number 2, the Soviet Union was all about that shit. Many people, with a tenuous grasp on reality, will often go so far as to claim that the USSR was actually a communist country. Now that's not entirely true, but that was certainly their stated goal, and they did make a lot of contributions to the science of Marxism. In fact, many modern-day communists look to the USSR's foundation as one of the first times that one of their own came to power as a country's government. Well, who exactly was one of their own? Only the most based, egalitarian-pilled giga-soy Chad ever to grace the city of Moscow, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Vladimir Lenin. He was the figurehead of the Russian Revolution, the important one, not the 6,000 that had happened before then. The reluctantly appointed first chairman of the Soviet government and a key intellectual figure in the development of Marxism. So much so, actually, that many communists today identify themselves specifically as Marxist-Leninists. Why do I mention all of this? Well, our book for today, State and Revolution, was written by Lenin at a key moment in his life, and also the history of all of Europe. The first drafts were written in 1916 during World War I, while Lenin was exiled in Switzerland due to his past revolutionary activity within his homeland of Russia, at that time the Russian Empire. The popularity of the empire at this particular point in time was in a freefall, as the brash Tsar Nicholas had recently gotten the country embroiled in the most destructive war fought in human history. At that point, not only were Russian soldiers dying en masse for a government that they despised, but the people stuck back home, who were mostly peasants, were starving to death. Believe it or not, there was a lot of resentment in Russia for the current political and economic order that was currently resulting in massive casualty numbers both on the battlefield and at home. In fact, one of those previously mentioned 6,000 revolutions had just broken out in February of 1917, with greedy entitled workers and peasants seeking to have enough food to eat. Another soon-to-be-destroyed European empire that was currently killing hundreds of thousands of their own people at home and abroad was that of Germany, who was fighting against Russia at the time. As you might expect, they watched with glee as the Russian people rose up against their government, hoping that a revolution would knock Russia out of the war and allow the Germans to focus on their enemies to the west. To that end, they rounded up a bunch of Russian exiles that had been living in Germany and the surrounding areas, and shipped them off to join in on the fun of the brewing Russian Civil War. This was the backdrop in which State and Revolution was written, with Lenin being hurried along German railways en route to Russia, where he was hoping to organize and galvanize the mass unrest into a force to be reckoned with. With that context in mind, let's dive in. Chapter 1. Class struggle and the state. Lenin starts the book with a talk about the way that progressive thinkers are often twisted and corrupted by the people in charge, who would be threatened were their thoughts to be implemented. We all know this. You can see an example of it in almost any progressive figure that's ever existed under capitalism. For some Yankee examples, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign and socialist sympathies are removed from the story taught in school, and he's whitewashed as an unopposed, uniting figure, while his existence at the time was so divisive that it actually caused mass riots across the country. Albert Einstein is taught only as a scientific figure, and his vocal support for communism is completely swept under the rug, so on and so on. This also happened during Lenin's time, even to one of the most progressive figures of them all, Karl Marx. This is the issue that Lenin is aiming to correct in the course of this book, and to support his argument, he used many lengthy quotations from Marx himself that I will mostly be cutting out for the sake of simplicity, but you should definitely go read them yourself. The text is linked in the description. Okay, appetizer over. Onto the main course. Lenin describes the Marxist view of the creation of the state. According to Marx and Engels, the state emerged in the first place as a side effect of the development of human society. Simply, it's an extension of the ruling class who need a tool for repressing the classes that are being ruled. In the Middle Ages, that's rich landowners creating a kingly state to execute rebels trying to make sure everyone's needs are met. In the 19th century, that's rich landowners creating a republican state to execute rebels trying to make sure everyone's needs are met. Simple as. Sick, but how the heck does this relate to our introduction? Well, at the time of the First World War, there was a group of communists that called themselves Social Democrats. Intentionally or not, Social Democrats were helping with the whitewashing of Marx's writings to make them less dangerous to and more attractive to the ruling business owners. Basically, Social Democrats want you to work within the corrupt business owner state to dismantle capitalism, rather than engaging in revolution to overthrow it. This particular group of whitewashers are the ones that Lenin here is writing to condemn. Lenin begins his argument by summarizing Marx's view of the origin of the state. Marx and Engels wrote of the state as a tool created from from the beginning to maintain the domination of the ruling class over the ruled. Just on the face of it, it seems kinda unlikely that a tool created for that purpose would allow for the possibility of the ruled taking control of that tool from the inside. That's like trying to abolish prisons by going into solitary confinement and arguing with the guards. Just ridiculous, isn't it? Well, what if you can convince the guards to let you go, you might ask. Yeah, as absurd as it sounds, that is a very, very, very small possibility, because humans are occasionally capable of abstract reasoning. But here's the key. Marxism as an ideology isn't interested in things that are theoretically doable. Marxism is an ideology that is interested solely in the material reality that we live in, and mapping the most effective route to change that reality for the better. In the prison analogy, the prison guards feed themselves and their families by being paid to keep prisoners in prison. Makes it difficult to be convinced to let prisoners out. The business owner state bureaucrats feed themselves and their families by running the state. Makes it difficult to be convinced to abolish the business owner state. So you're not just convincing them that you should be let out, you're convincing them that you should be let out so bad that they need to be willing to starve for it. If you're feeling crusty, you could say that the material incentives of these two groups of people mean that if they were to abolish the institutions that they worked for, they would be jobless, likely unhoused, and starving. So you can already probably see why, while working within the state to abolish capitalism isn't completely impossible, in terms of effective organizing, it's small enough of a chance that it's not really worth pursuing. Lenin continues in his discussion of the origin of the state, detailing how it evolved from an ancient concept called the gens, which is kinda comparable to a very large extended family, or maybe a very small ethnicity in modern terms. Either way, when the gens began to morph into what we would today call a state, there were a couple of key changes. First, a state has jurisdiction over a specific geographic territory, an aspect that the gens lacked. Secondly, the state also includes control over, quote, public force, essentially a group of armed people who are given the authority to do violins, called, quote, public power, allegedly in the interest of the, quote, public good. You'll recognize these institutions as today's military and police. The very fact that public power, again, permission to do violins, was given to a specific part of society means that it was necessarily removed from broader society. Otherwise, it wouldn't mean anything to give it to that part of society. And why would a state feel the need to go out of its way to remove the ability of normal people within society to exert their public power? Because the state is acting against the interests of the ruled. If that wasn't the case, people could exert their public power themselves. Let's imagine, for a second, that the state had not removed public power from the masses. In that case, the only difference between our modern societies and our prehistoric ancestor societies would be the complexity of our tools for violins. A flock of Americans with bump stocks, rather than what Lenin calls a, quote, herd of monkeys grasping sticks. And what would those bump stocks be used for? Well, to keep Americans from being evicted, to keep bleach from being poured over excess food in the dumpsters. People would use violins mostly to get what they need from the people that have it. Class warfare in the most literal sense. Basically, the state, military, and police are all created by the people with all the stuff to prevent the people without all the stuff from taking what they need. It is created by and for the business owners. It is literally designed from the beginning to prevent the rise of socialism. You don't even need to look to the origins of the business owner state from hundreds of years ago. If this point were correct, you would expect to see the power of the state grow sharply as class antagonisms sharpen, like they did in 2020 with the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. And bingo bango, 90% of cities and counties within the US have increased police budgets since 2020, with some increasing them by more than 25%. If that's not enough for you, let's take a look at the exact opposite scenario. When class antagonisms are relatively undeveloped, we would expect to see less of a concentration of public power into the state, i.e. the police. For example, in the American Southwest during the 1800s, given this land belonged to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island until it was very recently stolen by the whites, European capitalism had yet to get a good foothold here. And wouldn't you know it, again, my prediction is proven right. The state's hold in this context was very loose, and public power was still relatively equally distributed. For anyone unfamiliar, the way that policing worked in the American Southwest at this time was a sheriff model, where there would be one or a handful of armed state representatives in a given region, and they would gather groups of armed commoners, called posses, to help them enforce the law as needed. Often, laws could not be fully enforced because there just weren't people willing to volunteer to be in the posse. So, if the material reality of the business owner state at the time made the concept of social democracy provably a pipe dream at best, what the hell were they on about? Well, incorrect, idea at the time was that the state could be separated from the business owners during periods of equilibrium in the class conflict. Essentially, they thought that when things were going smoothly, workers could elect communists, and then when things got rougher, those communists would ally with the workers rather than with the business owners. Needless to say, that's not how any of this works. At this point, Lenin goes into a little more detail in his analysis of exactly how the state works. In a capitalist republic, the power of the business owners is wielded indirectly. They generally don't elect Elrond Mosk to the White House directly, inshallah. Instead, they elect some random schmuck, and then Elrond Mosk gives that schmuck a bunch of money to do what he wants. Funnily enough, Lenin explicitly gives the US here as an example of direct corruption, most likely pointing to the political machines that existed at the time, where political parties essentially had violent street gangs that worked for them to get votes and funding. This tradition continues proudly into the present day with the existence of political action committees and dark money, well-developed financial instruments used to bribe politicians without the public being able to trace the source of that money. But direct bribery and extortion is so passé nowadays, so generally politicians are kept loyal to their corporate overlords in even less direct ways. For instance, if you ever hear a single goddamn word from any member of the US government, there's a 50-50 chance that word is going to be GDP. This is supposedly the most important measure of a given country's economy, despite the fact that it's an incredibly inaccurate measure and also completely leaves out the issue of wealth distribution within a country. What GDP measures best is the whole size of the economy, information that is basically useless to real people, but actually a decent indicator of the total wealth of all the business owners in a country. It also, more importantly, gives a somewhat accurate measure of the health of the stock market, the international gambling ring that politicians and business owners actually use to make most of their income with capital gains. You see, the people who are supposedly in charge of regulating the economy, politicians, are actually some of the most vigorous investors in that economy and collect massive payouts from companies that they influence with government regulation. It's such a big industry that there's an entire cottage industry of stock traders that follow and report politicians' moves in the stock market. While this might seem to be an incredibly evil conflict of interest and abuse of power, with people who claim to be public servants gambling on the market that they're supposed to regulate, it is exactly that. If all else fails though, Elrond Mosk can get what he wants from the ghouls in DC by offering them a cushy job at his lobbying firm when their term expires, taking them from indirectly into his pocket to literally sucking on his pocket square. This is such a well-known and widely used career path that it is considered to be part and parcel with serving as a politician in the US. Thanks to all of this slightly less than open corruption, Lenin suggests that a capitalist republic is actually the most stable form of capitalism that there is, which seems to be proven right by the spread of capitalist republics across basically every corner of the world in the decades since his death. So, all of that said, Social Democrats, please tell me again how the state can be wrested from capital to serve the interests of the working class. When confronted with this, SocDems will often claim that one of the core issues that causes all of this is the lack of universal suffrage. In Lenin's time, this was the prohibition of women, native, and black votes, and today this is generally the prohibition of prisoners' votes, and the somewhat less explicit repression of women, native, and black votes. And while this is all morally detestable, from a material perspective, as the loosening of voting restrictions in the last century has shown, enabling these groups to vote has not and will not change the outcomes of the state. In fact, things have gotten materially worse for most people, as the owning class has found that they can use identity politics to obscure the class politics that created the material differences between identity groups in the first place. For an example, take a look at the manufactured outrage at the existence of trans people, where certain media conglomerates sell your weird uncle the idea that he was laid off because trans people aren't being oppressed hard enough. A key development of the state going from monarchy to the capitalist republic was the incorporation of opposition and dissent into the state itself, where the complaints of the working class can be contained, controlled, and eventually dismissed, all while keeping the appearance of democracy. For an example, look no further than everyone's least favorite party, the Democrats. How did they respond to the rampant institutional murder of black people across the country leading to uprisings in every major city? They put on some kente cloth scarves and staged a photo op, then went into the Capitol building and voted to increase police funding across the board. How did they respond to the demand for student loan forgiveness? They made a limp-dicked attempt to forgive a tiny fraction of it, and then did nothing when Republicans, of course, stopped it, despite making campaign promises to the contrary, and also possessing the political power to do so. I can go on for days, not only with the Democrats, but also Labour in the UK, the SPD in Germany, and more or less every single left party in the modern Western world. There's a concept in systems theory called the purpose of a system is what it does that I think comes in handy here. It's luckily pretty self-explanatory. A system that consistently produces results that are the opposite of its stated intent prove that the stated intent is in fact a lie, and that the results produced are in fact the goal from the beginning. The purpose of a left-wing party in a capitalist republic is what it does. Even parties that claim, or at one time claimed, to be communist, like the SPD in Germany, they do not serve the interests of the working class. They contain, control, and ultimately defuse popular working class opposition to the selfish, destructive policies of the owning class. I've gone on a long enough tangent here already that I feel comfortable going whole hog and just continue, but I'd like at this point to make clear that this next point is my own, but I think it connects well with Lenin's thoughts on the state. The state is such a well-made tool of controlled opposition that even if someone sees through the facade of false progressiveness from the left party, there's another trap waiting to catch them and suck them into the quagmire of electoral politics. The Republicans, the Tories, the AfD, and their precursors from the interwar period all function as controlled opposition in a different capacity by capitalizing on the alienating effect of realizing that the left party is useless. They do so by claiming that the reason that the left party is so useless is because they've been corrupted, not by their corporate masters or deliberate systemic uselessness, but by the Jews or the trans or whatever scapegoat they've chosen this time around. They say the problem isn't the economy, it's the demographics. Ignorant colonial narratives about marginalized people are recycled and repurposed at home to give the state a reason to exist that doesn't involve challenging the status quo that they support and benefit from. Basically, if you ask a working class German in 1925 what the purpose of the state is, it's to keep capital in check and fight for the rights of the workers. You ask that same German in 1935, after they've realized that the state is either incapable or unwilling to do that, and the purpose of the state is to keep marginalized groups in check and fight for the rights of the Germans. There's a reason that many fascists have historically been disillusioned communists. Okay, tangent over, back to the text. Social democrats often justify their frankly irrational positions by conflating the business owner state and the workers' state. It's a well-known point that communists assert that the state will inevitably wither away, and thus society will progress from socialism into communism. But social democrats misuse this point, claiming that Marx was referring to the business owner state withering away into a workers' state, which is clearly not the case. Marx and principled communists all recognize that the material realities of life within a business owner's state can only be changed through revolution, and then once a workers' state has been implemented, the process of withering can begin. Lenin clarifies the difference between a business owner and a workers' state by inviting the reader to replace the word state with the phrase special repressive force. This subtle reframing begs the question, who is being repressed and who is doing the repression? In a business owner society, the state is a special repressive force that represses the working class for the benefit of the owner class. The exact opposite is true within a workers' state. A workers' state is a special repressive force that represses the owning class for the benefit of the working class. Why is this better? The business owner class is a privileged minority whose class interests take the form of resisting the progress of society, while the working class is a downtrodden majority whose class interests take the form of accelerating societal progress. Once the state, which again was formed by the ruling owning class as a tool to repress the working class, is abolished and replaced by a workers' state, a tool used to repress the owning class will begin to shrink, and by the time it's gone, the state will not have any other reason to exist, and that is when the state will begin to wither away. This has been basic knowledge since the very beginning of communist theory, with Lenin quoting at length from the OG Champagne socialist Friedrich Engels, who specifically claims that the overthrow of the business state must be violin, not for the sake of bloodlust, but because history has proven that the business owner state will not allow any other option to unseat them. With this in mind, you can see that when social democrats refer to a people's free state, or socialism, or democracy, they refer to a capitalist republic with a nice shiny red coat of paint slapped on top. Of course, it's none of those things unless you vote for that party in the elections, meaning that you are held captive to their elections forever. This cognitive dissonance is made possible through what Lenin refers to as, quote, eclecticism, or basically cherry-picking quotes from various texts, rather than actually dedicating the time and energy to learn and understand dialectical materialism. Damn, Lenin is literally me, for real. In fact, based on this analysis, social democracy is in fact the best servant of the owning class, as Lenin points out, because not only does it serve their material interests by defusing revolutionary threats, but it also gives the members of the working class a sense of satisfaction and progress, making them happier with what is more or less the status quo.
Thanks for watching. If you're new to this, let me know how I did. Does this make any sense at all, or are you more confused than you were before? If you're old to this, let me know what you think I missed, and leave your reading recommendations in the comments. If you made it to the end of this part, please negate the algorithm's distaste for communist content by liking and subscribing. If you're a freak, you can also ring the notification bell to see when I get around to uploading the next 4 parts of this monster video. I'll see you in hell.
Lastly, but most importantly, the views expressed in this video are solely those of the book's author, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, and do not necessarily reflect the views of the video creator. It has been made solely for educational and entertainment purposes, and the creator does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy, applicability, fitness, or completeness of the content within. Please don't hurt me.